Investor Intelligence provides general information only. You should consider seeking independent advice to see how this information relates to your unique circumstances. Please refer to the terms and conditions available at investorintelligence.com.au for more.
Welcome to this week's episode of Investor Intelligence, your weekly podcast on all things investment, hosted by me, Jacob Kearns. When it comes to property investing, understanding property contracts might be up there with some of the more intimidating aspects of growing a property portfolio. Understanding contracts is an essential part of a well thought out strategy. And with me today, I have two special guests from the team over at the Property Mentors. I have the Mentor Team Director, Mr. Herman Benade. Welcome back, Herman.
Thanks for having me, mate.
And I also have the Senior Property Mentor, Mr. Pat Ruiter. Welcome back again, Pat.
Thanks, Jacob.
So, Pat, you've been doing this for a long time and you've guided many investors through the process of buying property. I'll throw the first question to you. What are the most common contract types that investors encounter?
Yeah, good question. So there's two ways that you could split this up. So firstly, we could look at an already existing property, something that's already been completed. And for those types of properties, there is only one contract type, and that's a one-part contract.
Right.
So if we're looking at off-the-plan properties, off-the-plan purchases, it's a little bit different. So there's two different types of contracts, a one-part contract and a two-part contract.
Okay. And can you walk us through what the difference is with those and what the typical buying process would look like for each?
Okay, so if we're looking at a one-part contract off the plan purchase, the process firstly will start off with the investor securing the property and signing the contract. So when you sign the contract, you'll pay your deposit the same day, and usually that's a 10% deposit. And from there, the construction period might take 12 months, let's say. And when you receive the occupancy certificate and titles have been issued for that property is when you'll start organising finance with the broker, and you will settle on the property and you'll pay any associated costs with settling the property.
Right. So once you secure the property, you pay the deposit, and then whenever the property settles, whether it's 12 months, 6, whatever, that's when you pay the rest of the costs.
Yeah. So there's no other costs in between that.
Okay, and then how does that differ between a two-part contract?
Yeah, so with a two-part contract, it's very much in the name. So there's two different parts of the contract, or really there's two different contracts. So the process of a two-part contract starts off with the investor securing the property or the opportunity. And firstly, they'll pay a 10% deposit to secure the land. So there's two different ways you could go about this. You could purchase the land and the home as one package, or you could purchase the land and appoint your own builder. So to explain that further, if you're buying the home and land as a package, you'll usually pay the 10% deposit on the land and a 5% build deposit to secure the package,
right?
Basically.
Okay.
If you were looking at it where you were going to appoint your own builder, you would purchase the land, basically. So you would put a 10% deposit on the land, and then you could wait 6 months before you appoint your own builder if you wanted to. So the key difference is that because you are settling on the land straight away, you will have finance initially. So you will have a loan on the land initially, and throughout the build, you will pay loan repayments throughout that time until the property is completed.
Okay, and then so with the first one-part contract, you get finance once the property settles. Whereas with the two-part, it at different stages?
Yeah, so when you're in a one-part contract, you'll settle on the entire product at the end. And then, therefore, you'll have your finance ready at the end. Whereas with the two-part contract, you're settling on the land, you'll become the legal owner of the land initially. So you'll have finance for that land as well.
Okay. And Herman, when would a one-part contract fit into an investor's strategy versus a two-part?
It doesn't, basically, quite simply. You don't make a decision on which property you're going to purchase based on what contract type that property has. It can play a part in terms of getting into the market a little bit quicker. So let's say you've got an investor that's earning a decent amount of money. They can hold the holding costs for the land component while the property is being built. In a case like that, the investor might want to have a look at a 2-part contract instead of a 1-part contract, because your settlement costs are going to be significantly reduced due to stamp duty. So going back on what Pat just said, if you think about a 2-part contract as 2 separate products, one being the land and one being the build, stamp duty is only charged on the first transaction that takes place, which will be the land in this case. So let's say you've got a 500k property. If that was a 1-part contract, your stamp duty, depending on which state you would be in, would be anywhere from $22,000 to $28,000 as the stamp duty obligations. If it was a 2-part contract, the proportion that you're settling on first is what the stamp duty gets charged on. So let's say out of that 500k, 150k is the land component. You are going to be paying stamp duty on the land component alone, which takes it down from 28k to 4-5k, again, depending on which state you're in. Okay, so if you're in a situation where you know you can pay the repayments without any income coming in against that asset, right, but you don't have all the settlement costs right now, or you don't have 80k sitting in your bank account to do the LMI, the stamp duty, all of those kind of things, it might be beneficial for your strategy to have a look at a 2-part contract so you can get into the market a little bit sooner. And saying that is really one of the last considerations you should have. The property fundamentals still need to make sense. You shouldn't just go and enter into a contract because of its contract type. In saying that, it swings and roundabouts. If you've got a 1-part contract, then obviously there's no holding costs on the land, right? So it really depends on which environment we're in. If we've got high interest rates, then obviously your repayments on that land is going to be higher. If we've got low interest rates, then you'll find there's more competition in the market for 2-part contracts, because holding that land is next to nothing and you're saving on the stamp duty component. So to give you an example, during COVID, we mostly saw 1-part contracts. Now with interest rates being where they are, we mostly see 2-part contracts.
So are there any pros and cons or risks associated with either of those contracts?
I wouldn't look at it as pros and cons. I would purely look at the risk profile. So like I said, we won't be making a decision as to which investment we're going into based on the contract type. We do need to know what contract type it is before we enter into any contract, because depending on your income, how that income is structured, a broker might tell you you can't go into a 2-part contract because your serviceability isn't high enough, or whatever the reason might be. Once you sign that contract, you're in a legal binding contract. So it is absolutely crucial that you speak to your broker and your conveyancer before entering into any contract, particularly 2-part contracts, to ensure that you can actually get a loan against it. And you can break that down even further. In some cases, you can go into a 2-part contract providing that you apply for the land and the build at exactly the same time. So some banks will want to know that there's an actual product going on that piece of land that's going to bring in income before they give you a loan against that. Where, let's say you've got a really high amount of disposable income, you might be able to settle on the land alone and build on it whenever you want. But you need to check this with your broker before you enter into any of it.
Yeah, okay. So you mentioned 2-part contracts can be good for someone who might not have a lot of cash in the bank but still has a really good income. Do you have an example that comes to mind of a client you've helped in that situation and how that worked out for them?
Not really. Like I said, we don't make decisions based on it. Like in some cases, I'm working with a couple at the moment who's essentially waiting for a settlement to take place. So they need that settlement to take place before this property settles. So in that case, I want to keep their settlement costs as low as possible, so we're not draining their bank accounts down to zero. So a two-part contract makes a lot more sense in that case, because they're not having to access any equity. They can pretty much use the cash they've got in the bank to settle on the property, and they are both on really good incomes, so we know that they can afford the repayments for that time period. But again, I didn't start my search looking for two-part contracts. I started my search looking for the best investment, and it just happens to be a two-part contract. So if there was an investment that was better than the one I presented to them, that was a one-part contract, I would try to figure out how to make the one-part contract work before looking at other ones, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. What about any tax implications that investors should be aware of with either types of contracts?
I'm not an accountant, but I've spoken about stamp duty before. That's a tax. That's a clear differentiator between the two different contracts. I do know that you can't claim any of your interest as a tax benefit until there's a structure on the actual piece of land and it's an actual investment property. But you really need to speak to your accountant about anything to do with taxes before you do anything else. Not your broker, not your conveyancer. Your accountant is the person that should be advising you around that.
Yeah, no, for sure. And one other thing I wanted to discuss with you guys, in terms of self-managed super funds and how the different types of contracts play into that, is there any distinction between buying in your super fund versus not?
Yeah, so in a self-managed super fund, you are only allowed to purchase using a one-part contract. So ASIC will not allow self-managed super funds to purchase property with a two-part contract, and that's due to a potential risk profile of the two-part contract.
Further to that, like anything in your SMSF, think about it like a time capsule, if you want. Let's say you buy a property that was built in the 80s in your SMSF. If you wanted to renovate that property, you can't just go and put a brand new kitchen or anything like that in there, because the government does not want you to do any development in your SMSF. It needs to have a really low risk profile for any asset class that you put in there. So with that in mind, a two-part contract is essentially considered development. So like you couldn't, as a developer, go and buy a piece of land in your super and go and put 20 townhouses on there to develop and sell to the market. That's not allowed. This is exactly the same process. So you are buying a piece of land, then you're constructing on it. And that's what's not allowed in your super fund. It's not like a one-part, two-part contract gets you the same product at the end of the day. It's how that contract operates that APRA and ASIC is mostly concerned about. Like, what are you actually doing? What if that development doesn't go through? What if the builder goes bust and you don't get a product on that? How is that benefiting the money in your super fund?
Yeah, awesome. Good to know. Well, I appreciate you guys coming on and walking us through this. Is there anything you want to add to summarize or anything else on what we've discussed already?
Yeah, actually, the market conditions is probably the one thing to note. So if people are listening to this saying and getting the idea in their head that, hey, I'm going to go out there and go and find two-part contracts or go and find one-part contracts because I like the sound of that, 90% of the time, it's dictated to us by the market what kind of contracts we see. Okay, so if we've got high interest rates, we get two-part contracts. If we've got low interest rates, we get one-part contracts. So bear in mind that for developers to keep their products competitive, they need to be able to swap between these two different contract types, because if you had to put the holding costs of, let's say, a $6-7 million piece of land onto the developer is not going to wear that costs. They're going to have to build that into the price. So if you're building townhouses in Wyndham Vale, for instance, you can't all of a sudden start charging $900,000 for a townhouse. It's not not competitive with the market. So what they do to mitigate that is they separate the contract, right? So they don't have to pass that holding cost, bearing in mind that developers tend to pay a higher interest rate than what we do, and the amount of debt in the projects is significantly more. So if you're looking at 9% on 6 million in comparison to 6.5% on 150,000, you can kind of do the maths for yourself there as to why they tackle it like that. So I don't want people to walk away from this thinking that two-part contracts means that the developer is passing on the holding costs to you. They're trying to sell their products as close to market rate as what they can without having to build in these extra things that do tend to build up really quickly when we're talking about large sums of money like this. Okay, so the most important thing is that you speak to your experts around you and you understand how that contract is going to affect you specifically. And if that makes sense, then almost don't worry about the contract. If you're doing it for a specific reason, then like you don't have enough settlement costs, then you might want to tell whoever is sourcing property for you that, hey, can we look at two-part contracts instead of one-part contracts? But definitely as a last selection process, not as something that you put on the top of your selection process.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Pat, anything to add?
Yeah, I think you make a really good point, Herman. The investment fundamentals will always come first. The property itself will always come first. The type of contract is always going to be dictated by the market at the time. So it's a lot of the time out of your control as the investor, and it's not the main point. The investment fundamentals always take priority.
I'll just add to that, Pat, because you just reminded me of something. In this podcast, we're obviously talking about 1 and 2 part contracts, and the reason why we've chosen this specific topic is because of the market conditions that we're in at the moment. More importantly, if you're buying any properties through realestate.com, like your own home or an investment property that's already established on realestate.com, the bits that you want to be more concerned about in an established property contract is making sure that you've got provisions in there for your finance, for pest inspections. You want to make sure that you get, if it's under strata, the strata minutes, or all the strata documents, any special levies, all of those kind of things are actually deal breakers. Like that kind of negotiation when we're coming to a contract, that rises to the top in your property selection when you're looking at already established property. When you're looking at off the plan, obviously it's newly built, so it's not going to have any pests in it. It's not going to need a building inspection done. It won't have a subject to finance clause. It's kind of take it or leave it with subject off the plan contracts, where if you're on realestate.com, you as the buyer have the right to ask for these conditions in your contract, and you should be asking for these conditions in your contract because it's just protecting you.
Yeah, great information.
Yeah, and I think the best way to go about that entire process would to be engage a conveyancer for sure, so that you're protected when purchasing established property and you understand the risk associated with that potential property. And yeah, just making sure you're protected and putting any clauses in there, negotiating them where you can.
Yeah, awesome. Well, thanks, Herman. Thanks, Pat. I appreciate you guys coming on and giving us some really good information on this.
That's all right.
Thanks for having me.
If you found this episode or any of our episodes helpful, please make sure to share and leave a rating to help us reach more people on their investing journeys. And of course, subscribe to be notified when new episodes drop. Make sure to follow the podcast on Instagram at Investor Intelligence Podcast. You can find links to our other socials in the show notes, including a link to the Property Mentors weekly blog. If you're ready to get your property portfolio in shape for financial freedom, check out Luke's latest book, Property Fit. You can get yourself a copy at www.propertyfitbook.com.au.